How does a man remembered for gentle charity emerge from storms, captivity, and spiritual trials that transformed path he walked? Good evening, dear friends. Wherever you find yourself tonight, settle into this shared quiet moment. Join our Saint Lives family, and remember to subscribe as we begin this journey together. This is the story of Vincent de Paul, whose journey from early ambition through suffering and captivity toward a heart remade by grace revealed a life devoted to serving Christ in the poor and reshaped the Church's understanding of charity. The story of Saint Vincent de Paul continues now by returning to the quiet fields of his childhood, where simplicity and hidden grace first touched his young heart. Long before he became the gentle reformer of charity, Vincent was simply a boy of Gascony, shaped by earth, sky, and the patient rhythms of rural life. He was born in 1581 in the small village of Puy, a place where the land seemed to cradle families in humble labor and quiet endurance. His parents, Jean and Bertrand, worked the soil with hands worn by honest work, and their home carried the scent of straw, wool, and the warmth of a hearth that rarely saw abundance. Vincent grew up watching his father tend the fields and livestock, noticing the simple pride he took in providing for his growing family. It was a world where faith was woven naturally into each day, a whispered prayer before sunrise, a blessing murmured while bread was broken, a trust in God that rested not on learned theology, but on lived experience. In these fields, Vincent first sensed that life's greatest lessons often hide in ordinary tasks. He would guide the family's sheep across gentle hills, listening to the wind brush through the grass and the distant tolling of the parish bell. He learned patience from the rhythm of walking behind animals too young or too stubborn to keep their footing. And as he traced familiar paths day after day, his mind began to travel beyond them, stirring with questions about the world beyond Puy. Yet, for all the tenderness of his upbringing, there was also the quiet weight of poverty. Vincent's shoes often wore thin, his clothes were mended repeatedly, and meals were simple and sometimes scarce. Even as a child, he felt the subtle sting of being among the poorer families of the region. And though he rarely spoke of it, that awareness planted in him a longing, an early desire not for holiness, but for something more comfortable, more respected, more secure. It is often surprising to listeners that the saint renowned for humility first grew from the soil of ambition, but that, too, is part of God's mysterious shaping. Despite the scarcity of resources, Vincent's parents recognized his intelligence, the unusual quickness with which he learned letters and absorbed stories from visiting priests. They believed education could lift him beyond the limitations of rural life, and so, with considerable sacrifice, they arranged for him to study with local clergy. For the first time, he entered a small classroom that smelled of ink and parchment, and he felt the spark of possibility. His teachers noticed his sharp memory, his natural eloquence, and the seriousness in his expression even at a young age. It must have seemed like the beginning of a promising future, yet even then, Vincent's heart was divided. He admired the clergy who taught him, their clean garments, their knowledge, and the honor they seemed to command. The idea of priesthood began to take shape in his imagination, not as a calling of service, but as a path out of the poverty that weighed on his family. He dreamed, not of sanctity, but of earning enough to support his loved ones and secure his own comfort. Who could blame him? Many saints begin with imperfect motives, and God patiently refines them. But the seeds of Vincent's transformation were not yet visible. Instead, he continued his studies with determination, encouraged by his parents, who quietly hoped he might one day rise above the limitations they themselves had endured. His father, though uneducated, saw something rare in his son's eyes, something worth every sacrifice. There is a gentle beauty in that silent trust, the way a parent's hope can shape a destiny without ever being expressed aloud. As Vincent grew older, his world slowly expanded. He would travel beyond his village for lessons, seeing towns where stone houses stood sturdier than those of Puy, where markets bustled and merchants handled coins with ease. These glimpses of a broader life stirred his imagination even more deeply. He began to notice the social differences between those who labored and those who led. He understood, in a way too mature for his years, that knowledge could open doors closed to children like him. And so he studied diligently, driven by the hope of elevating his family's circumstances. Yet, even as ambition pushed him forward, the quiet faith of his childhood continued to whisper beneath the surface. He watched elderly farmers pray with devotion deeper than any book could teach. He listened to villagers speak of God with the familiarity of friends who rely on him daily. He noticed how suffering, accepted with trust, transformed even the most difficult days. These impressions left traces upon his soul, soft footprints that would guide him later when life grew dark. As he moved toward his adolescent years, Vincent began to help his family more consciously, aware of the sacrifices they made so he could study. He worked beside his father when home from school, mending fences, carrying water, tending animals. These tasks kept him grounded, even as the allure of a different life shimmered somewhere in the distance. Perhaps this is why he never lost his affinity for the poor, even in later years of leadership. He had lived their life, felt their burdens, and breathed their anxieties. His heart would one day recognize Christ in the poor because he had known their world from within. And yet, at this stage in his life, that recognition remained hidden, dormant like a seed, waiting for the right season to break open. Vincent's thoughts were shaped more by what he hoped to escape than by what he hoped to embrace. It is comforting to remember that saints do not begin as saints. They grow through slow, often unseen changes. Eventually, the time came for Vincent to leave Puy for more advanced studies. His father accompanied him on the road, walking beside him with the quiet pride of a man offering all he had. Some accounts say that Jean sold the family's pair of oxen, the most valuable possession they owned, to pay for Vincent's schooling. Whether literally true or simply a story shaped by memory, the gesture reflects a deeper truth. Vincent's early journey was carried not by prestige, but by the sacrifice of humble love. As the young student walked away from his village, smelling once more the mixture of earth and wheat fields in the morning air, he carried within him both ambition and gratitude. He did not yet know how hardship, loss, and unexpected captivity would one day purify his heart. For now, he was simply a young man walking toward an unknown future, believing success waited just ahead. The landscape of Gascony stretched behind him like a gentle farewell, its quiet simplicity marking the end of his first chapter. And yet, who could have guessed how deeply these early shadows would shape the man he would become? From those early fields of Gascony, where the rhythms of earth and prayer formed the quiet foundation of his childhood, Vincent's path now leads into a wider world filled with promise, uncertainty, and the stirring flame of youthful ambition. As he left Puy behind, he carried the scent of soil on his clothes and the echo of his father's footsteps in his memory. Yet his heart began to pulse with dreams that were new and strangely bright. The young Vincent, though shaped by simplicity, felt a growing desire to rise, to ascend toward something he could barely name. The world he had glimpsed beyond his village, towns with sturdier homes, priests who spoke with confidence, scholars who commanded respect, seemed to call him forward. And so he entered his studies with a mixture of gratitude and restlessness, unsure where God was leading him, but hopeful that knowledge might open doors that poverty had kept closed. He studied first in nearby towns, then in larger institutions, and with each passing year, he grew more aware of his own intelligence. Books became companions, lessons became stepping stones, and the structure of academic life felt like an invitation to something greater. His teachers noticed his remarkable memory, his disciplined work ethic, and the earnest way he absorbed new material. It was not long before others began to speak of him as a young man destined for success, someone who might bring honor to his family and even comfort to himself. And in the quiet corners of his heart, Vincent allowed these thoughts to warm him. He imagined himself as a priest of influence, living in comfort, helping his parents through a position of social respect. To modern ears, this ambition may sound at odds with the saint he would become, but in truth, it reveals something deeply human: the longing to rise above hardship, to provide for those we love, and to carve out a place in the world where struggle no longer defines us. The financial sacrifices made for his education weighed on Vincent's conscience, even if he did not speak of them often. He knew how much his father had given up. He knew the cost of every lesson he received. Perhaps this sense of indebtedness fueled his determination. Perhaps it also added subtle pressure, an inner whisper that insisted he must succeed, he must rise, he must not let his family's hopes fall into disappointment. This combination of gratitude, burden, and hope shaped the years of his formation. It is easy to forget that saints begin as ordinary young men and women, wrestling with fears, ambitions, and the quiet voice of grace trying to reach them beneath layers of earthly desire. Vincent felt that tension acutely. Though he prayed and attended Mass faithfully, he still held tightly to the belief that a clerical career would allow him comfort more than sacrifice. The priesthood, to him, was not yet a path of service. It was a means of stability. His formal studies in theology began with enthusiasm, but also with the youthful impatience that longs for advancement more than depth. He mastered Latin, debated with classmates, and listened to professors outline the intricacies of doctrine with voices that rose and fell like gentle tides. He was intelligent, diligent, and respected. Yet underneath the outward success, his heart remained unrefined. He pursued ordination at an unusually young age, perhaps before spiritual maturity had caught up with intellectual readiness. At this time in history, the formation of priests varied widely, and Vincent's own path reflected the imperfections of the era. His motives were mixed, and he was not blind to this. He simply assumed that God would accept his offering even if ambition lingered within it. Who among us can say we have never approached our vocations with a blend of hope, fear, and self-interest? Grace works slowly, often imperceptibly, within such tangled beginnings. When Vincent was ordained a priest at the age of 19, the ceremony unfolded with solemn beauty, candles flickering softly in the chapel, voices rising in quiet chant, and the scent of incense threading through the air like a prayer. It was a moment of outward dignity, perhaps even triumph for his family, but inwardly, the young priest stood at a crossroads he could not yet see. His ordination brought him joy and pride, yet it did not immediately transform him. His heart still longed for financial security, for a benefice that might lift his family from poverty. He hoped to obtain a position that would allow him to live comfortably, perhaps even with a small estate. This desire was not unusual for clergy of the time. Many pursued the priesthood with similar aims. And yet, within Vincent, a quiet sense of unease began to take shape, like a soft wind that unsettles the leaves without bending the branches. He began to sense that something in him was incomplete. After his ordination, Vincent pursued opportunities that aligned with his hopes. He traveled, made connections, taught students, and sought assistance from patrons who might secure him a stable position. In these early years, he was not yet the gentle father of the poor, nor the wise reformer of the clergy. He was simply a young priest navigating a complex world, trying to find his place in it. But beneath the surface of his efforts, something invisible and essential was happening. God was preparing him, not through dramatic visions or instant conversions, but through the gradual shaping of circumstances that would eventually draw him away from worldly ambition. These early experiences, though seemingly ordinary, laid the groundwork for the transformation that would come later, a transformation so profound that it would reshape not only his life, but the church itself. Gradually, Vincent began to discover that knowledge alone could not satisfy the deeper longing within him. He found himself drawn to prayer with increasing frequency. He experienced moments when ambition felt strangely hollow, as if the goals he had pursued so eagerly were losing their shine. He began to notice the quiet suffering of people around him. Students burdened by hardship, families struggling in silence, the poor who lingered outside church doors with hopeful eyes. These moments pierced him gently, not yet decisively, but enough to awaken an interior awareness that something in him was shifting. Grace rarely announces itself loudly. It often whispers first. And Vincent, though still imperfect, began to listen. As he grew into his priestly identity, he encountered mentors who saw potential in him, not for earthly success, but for spiritual depth. Their guidance helped him begin to perceive the subtle stirrings of God's voice. Yet even with this growing sensitivity, he did not abandon his aspirations. His heart remained divided, pulled between the world he hoped to enter and the deeper calling he did not yet fully understand. It was as though he stood on the threshold of two different futures, unaware that an unexpected event, a journey across the Mediterranean, would soon redirect the course of his entire life. The tension between grace calling him upward and ambition pulling him outward would accompany him until the moment his path was shattered and remade. But for now, the young priest walked forward, still hoping for comfort, unaware that God was preparing him for a transformation beyond anything he could imagine. How does God redirect a heart that dreams only of comfort? From the quiet tension of Vincent's early priesthood, where ambition wrestled softly with the whisper of grace, his story now moves toward a moment that would break open his life in a way he never sought or expected. The question of how God redirects a heart longing for comfort finds its answer not in gentle guidance, but in a storm-tossed journey across the Mediterranean Sea. It was a voyage Vincent undertook with practical hopes, perhaps even with excitement. At this point in his life, he had secured a modest position and continued seeking better opportunities to support his family. Travel held the promise of advancement, and the sea offered a passage toward new connections and potential benefices. He could not know that this journey, so ordinary in its beginning, would become a crucible of transformation. The young priest boarded the ship with the confidence of someone who believed he understood the world's contours, unaware that the ocean was preparing to teach him lessons no classroom ever could. The Mediterranean, with its shimmering blue surface and deceptive calm, has long been a place where destinies shift. As Vincent's vessel cut through the water, he may have stood at the rail, watching the play of sunlight on the waves, imagining the future he hoped to shape. Yet beneath those waves lay dangers he could not see. Pirates from the Barbary coast prowled these waters, swift and merciless, seizing ships and selling captives into slavery. Maritime travel during this era carried such risks, but like many travelers, Vincent likely believed misfortune would pass him by. After all, he was a priest, a student, a man with plans still unfolding. But God, whose ways run deeper than human expectation, permitted a trial that would reshape the very core of Vincent's being. The attack came suddenly, fierce and unavoidable, Pirate vessels surrounded the ship, their sails cutting sharply against the horizon, their shouts rising in a harsh mixture of languages. The crew and passengers, overwhelmed and unarmed, could do little but surrender. In moments like these, a man's inner foundations tremble. The young priest who had hoped for comfort found himself stripped of every worldly security, freedom, possessions, the familiar dignity of his clerical role. He was taken with the other captives, transported to the shores of North Africa, and carried into a world where he was no longer a student, no longer a priest of promise, but simply a slave among many. Some storytellers have woven dramatic embellishments around these years of captivity, but beneath the varying accounts lies a quiet truth. Vincent's experience in North Africa pierced him deeply, humbling him in ways no earlier hardship had done. Captivity is not merely the loss of physical freedom. It is the collapse of self-reliance, the stripping away of illusions about one's own control over life. For a young man who had begun to imagine a life of comfort and respect, this sudden descent into vulnerability must have felt like a doorway into darkness. His first master, according to tradition, was a fisherman, and Vincent's early tasks involved the laborious work of tending boats, preparing nets, and serving as an attendant. The heat of the African sun pressed heavily on him, and the strangeness of the language and customs made him feel profoundly alone. Yet, even in these harsh circumstances, small seeds of grace began to take root. Vincent observed the endurance of the other captives, the quiet dignity of those who had lost everything but still clung to hope. He listened to conversations among slaves who found solace in prayer, whispered under the cover of night. These moments softened something in him. The ambition that had driven him began to fade, replaced slowly by an awareness of how fragile human life truly is when stripped of comfort. His second master, a physician skilled in alchemy, exposed Vincent to a different world, one filled with strange experiments and unusual theories. Here, too, Vincent endured servitude, but he also witnessed the complexity of human minds shaped by fear, curiosity, and the desire for power. The physician treated him with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant trust. And though Vincent remained a slave, he learned to observe the human heart with new attentiveness. It is often in unexpected places that God teaches us to see others more clearly. The most significant chapter of his captivity came with his third master, a former Christian who had converted to Islam. This man had been a Franciscan friar before his renunciation of the faith, and the shift in his beliefs created a subtle sorrow that lingered in his home. His wives, curious about Vincent's past, questioned him about his priesthood, his beliefs, and the God he served. In those conversations, spoken softly and cautiously, Vincent's faith, once mixed with ambition, began to breathe more freely. Perhaps he sensed for the first time that being a priest was not a pathway to comfort, but a sign of belonging to Christ in every circumstance, even in chains. According to the most traditional accounts, one of the master's wives was deeply moved by Vincent's quiet constancy and urged her husband to reconsider his abandonment of Christianity. Her persistence, combined with Vincent's example, eventually led the man to repentance. And with repentance came a daring decision. He and Vincent would flee together, seeking freedom across the sea. The escape was perilous, involving long hours of travel and the constant danger of recapture. Yet through a blend of courage and providential protection, they reached safety, eventually arriving in France, where Vincent stepped once more onto familiar soil, yet not as the same man who had left. Freedom did not restore him to his earlier ambitions. Instead, it awakened within him a profound awareness that his life no longer belonged to his own dreams. Something had broken open during those years of servitude, a recognition of the poor, the suffering, the captive, as living icons of Christ. Vincent would not articulate this transformation immediately. Spiritual awakenings rarely announce themselves suddenly. But from this point forward, the thread of his life began to weave itself in a new direction, pulled gently toward the forgotten and the overlooked. As he returned to France, carrying little more than memories of hardship and the quiet lessons learned in captivity, he faced a question deeper than any before. What now? He had been freed in body, but his heart had been reshaped. Comfort no longer seemed enough. Prestige no longer held the same shine. He sensed, perhaps dimly, that God had used the storm and the chains to clear a new path, one that would unfold step by step, marked by humility, obedience, and a steady return toward those whom society disregarded. In the silence of captivity, what new light might begin to flicker? From the fragile flicker of light that began to awaken within Vincent during the uncertain days of his captivity, the story now deepens into the quiet and often misunderstood years he spent in North Africa, years that would become the hidden furnace of his transformation. Although the details preserved by history vary in shading and certainty, the spiritual truth remains the same. These years marked a profound interior turning, a soft but decisive reshaping of a young priest once drawn by ambition into a man whose heart would one day recognize Christ in even the most abandoned. It is important to enter this chapter gently, not as an exotic tale of danger or dramatic suffering, but as a season in which God worked silently, slowly, within the spaces of Vincent's helplessness. What unfolds here is not a tale of heroics, but of humility, endurance, and an awakening that took place far from the public eye. When Vincent first stepped onto the soil of North Africa as a captive, he carried with him not only fear and confusion, but also the lingering remnants of his earlier aspirations. He had imagined a life of comfort and clerical status. Instead, he found himself thrust into a world where he had no control, no titles, and no security. Yet it is often in such stripped bare circumstances that God plants seeds of change that could not take root in the softer soil of comfort. His first master, as the traditional accounts tell us, was a fisherman, and it was in the harsh rhythms of daily labor that Vincent tasted the full weight of his new reality. The sun over Tunis was unforgiving, its heat pressing down with an intensity that felt almost personal. The work was repetitive and physically exhausting. The language barrier added an invisible wall around him, deepening the sense of isolation. And yet, as he bent to tasks he had never imagined performing, Vincent began to notice small details that revealed a new dimension of life. How the simplest gestures of kindness between captives soothed weary spirits, how the human heart remained capable of hope even in chains, and how suffering stripped away all illusions of self-importance. In these earliest months of servitude, something quiet but essential began to take root in him. The experience of being powerless softened the inner rigidity formed by ambition. He began to see the world differently, not through the lens of status, but through the deeper truth of human fragility. This recognition did not immediately transform him into the saint he would become, but it marked the beginning of that slow interior reorientation, one that would continue to deepen with each new master he served. The second master, the alchemist physician, introduced Vincent to a household filled with unusual studies and strange experiments. Here, he learned to observe human nature more closely, witnessing how fear, intelligence, superstition, and curiosity intertwined in complex ways. The physician relied on Vincent in small ways, perhaps trusting his steadiness more than he admitted. The tasks Vincent performed were different from the grueling labor of the first master, but servitude remained servitude. Even so, he found moments of stillness in this household, moments when he could reflect, pray in silence, and wrestle with the growing sense that God had permitted this trial for reasons hidden beyond his understanding. But it was the third master, whose story lingers in the tradition of Vincent's life with a kind of delicate poignancy, who became the unexpected instrument of his deepest inner change. This master, once a Franciscan friar, had renounced his faith and embraced Islam to secure survival and stability in a foreign land. Beneath this decision, however, was a sorrow that had not been fully extinguished. Vincent entered this home not as an equal, not even as a guest, but as a slave. Yet here the spiritual soil became particularly fertile. The wives of his master, intrigued by Vincent's quiet demeanor and the dignity he carried even in bondage, questioned him about his past, about the priesthood, about the faith he claimed to still hold. These conversations, whispered in secret corners and shaded courtyards, opened a space in which Vincent's priestly identity, still imperfect, still mixed with ambition, found a deeper purpose. For the first time in his life, Vincent spoke about the faith not to impress others or to advance his career, but simply because it was the truth of who he was. The more he spoke of Christ, of hope, of the mercy of God, the more he felt the words shaping him from within. Faith, spoken aloud in darkness, often becomes more real. And in this household, where a fallen Christian wrestled inwardly with regret and unease, Vincent's presence became a quiet testimony that stirred old memories and unhealed wounds. It is said that the master's favorite wife, a woman of intelligence and spiritual sensitivity, pressed her husband to reconsider the faith he had abandoned. Her questions, her insistence, and the gentle influence of Vincent's integrity eventually led the man to repentance. Whether every detail unfolded exactly as later storytellers described, the core truth remains. God used an unexpected relationship, formed in the unlikely setting of enslavement, to bring healing to a soul and freedom to Vincent. The escape that followed required immense courage. They fled under cover of darkness, taking a small boat across treacherous waters, entrusting themselves entirely to Providence. In those perilous hours on the open sea, Vincent, stripped of all status and still bruised by suffering, clung to the only certainty he had left. God was with him. Perhaps he prayed quietly, perhaps he simply listened to the sound of waves and let the memories of his captivity settle into something like surrender. Freedom, when it finally came, was not triumphant. It was humble, fragile, and deeply contemplative. Vincent returned to France not as the ambitious young cleric he had once been, but as a man who had been hollowed out and quietly remade. What happened inside him during those years cannot be measured by external accounts. The transformation was not sudden, but steady, like the slow carving of stone by water. His captivity did not make him resentful, it made him attentive. It did not embitter him, it softened him. It did not push him toward self-protection. It opened him toward the suffering of others. This was the mysterious interior conversion that would later shape every work he founded, every soul he guided, every reform he attempted. Yet at the moment of his return, Vincent himself did not fully grasp the depth of this change. Grace often works in ways we understand only in hindsight. He stepped back onto French soil quietly, carrying no riches and no grand achievements, only the memory of sand, sun, labor, and the slow awakening of compassion. And in the shadows of that memory, a new purpose began to glow softly, still hidden, but undeniably present. Sometimes grace hides itself beneath the dust of the most forgotten places. From the dust and silence of those forgotten places where grace had quietly reshaped his heart, Vincent now re-enters France carrying nothing outwardly remarkable, yet inwardly altered in ways he could not yet articulate. Freedom, when it finally settled upon him, did not arrive with banners or triumph, but with the delicate uncertainty of a new beginning. After years of captivity, the familiar landscapes of France must have appeared almost dreamlike. The soft curve of its hills, the gentler sunlight upon its fields, the familiar cadence of voices speaking a language he had not heard freely in so long. Yet Vincent's return did not usher him immediately into a clear future. Instead, he stepped into a life that felt both renewed and strangely unsettled. He was a priest, yes, but one who no longer understood what the priesthood was meant to be for him. He had been freed from chains, but carried within him a deeper kind of trembling, as though the memory of his suffering had stirred open questions that had not yet formed into words. In the months following his escape, Vincent sought to re-establish himself in society with the same diligence he had possessed before his captivity. He visited Paris, contacted mentors, and pursued practical matters that awaited him. Life, after all, did not pause simply because his heart had changed. Yet something subtle in him no longer clung to advancement with the same intensity as before. The ambitions that had once guided him now felt strangely distant, like the fading outline of a landscape he had passed through long ago. His old desires did not disappear instantly. Rarely does grace erase our inclinations at once, but they had lost their center of gravity. His soul, loosened from the grip of self-seeking, began to look toward God with a quiet attentiveness that had been absent in his earlier years. Still, this inner transformation did not spare him from hardship. In fact, his return to France was marked by trials that tested his humility in unexpected ways. Shortly after his arrival, Vincent became entangled in a painful accusation. A man in whose house he stayed reported the loss of money and suspected the young priest of theft. The accusation deeply wounded Vincent, who knew he was innocent, yet found himself powerless to defend his reputation. For months he lived under suspicion, the cloud of doubt pressing heavily on his conscience. It would have been easy to respond with anger or indignation. Yet Vincent, softened by the memory of his captivity, allowed this humiliation to settle into his soul as another form of purification. Perhaps he recognized, even if dimly, that the loss of public esteem could become fuel for deeper humility. Eventually, the true thief confessed, and Vincent was exonerated, but the experience left a mark upon him, a mark that whispered of the fragility of human praise and the necessity of placing trust only in God. During this uncertain period, God brought into Vincent's life a figure who would shape him profoundly, Pierre de Bérulle, the future cardinal and one of the great spiritual reformers of 17th century France. Bérulle possessed a deep understanding of the interior life, emphasizing humility, obedience, and conformity to Christ. Under his guidance, Vincent's heart began to shift from its earlier orientation toward self to a new disposition of availability to God. Bérulle saw something in Vincent, perhaps a hidden potential, perhaps the early light of a vocation not yet understood. He encouraged him not to seek positions of comfort, but to embrace assignments that would deepen his spiritual maturity. This guidance, coming at a moment when Vincent was already softened by suffering, struck deeply. Slowly, the desire to serve God above all else began to take root within him. It was at Bérulle's urging that Vincent accepted a role as chaplain and tutor in the household of the Gondi family, one of the most influential noble families in France. At first glance, this assignment might appear contrary to the humility Bérulle sought to cultivate, but God often works through surprising paths. In the Gondi household, Vincent was responsible for the spiritual care of the family and the education of their children. Yet it was the encounters he had with the peasants on the Gondi estates that would prove transformative. As he traveled with the family to their lands, Vincent witnessed firsthand the spiritual neglect and material suffering of rural communities. He saw peasants who lived in ignorance of their faith, who had not received confession for years, who struggled under the weight of poverty and burdens imposed by harsh social structures. These encounters awakened memories of his own childhood, of the silent hardships borne by his parents and neighbors in Gascony. But now, through the lens of his captivity and the guidance of his spiritual mentors, he saw more clearly. These people were Christ in disguise. This recognition did not come all at once, nor did it burst forth with emotional intensity. It grew quietly, like dawn spreading across the sky. Each journey with the Gandhi family revealed new faces of suffering. Each conversation with a neglected soul stirred in him a deeper sense of responsibility. Something within him began to respond, not with pity, but with compassion. A compassion that sought concrete action, not simply sentiment. For the first time, Vincent felt called not to pursue comfort, but to serve those who had none. Yet even as he began to sense this new direction, he struggled with uncertainty. What did God truly want from him? Was he prepared to surrender his own dreams entirely? The question lingered in the quiet spaces of his prayer, unsettling him gently. Vincent had tasted freedom after captivity, but now he began to understand that true freedom was found not in pursuing one's own path, but in discovering the path God gently unfolds. In these early years of renewed ministry, Vincent discovered that grace does not always feel like light. Sometimes it feels like a slow breaking open of the heart. He learned that poverty was not simply a condition to be pitied, but a mystery that revealed the humility of Christ. The peasants he served taught him through their endurance, their simplicity, their unspoken prayers. He found his heart returning to them in thought, even when he was in the refined rooms of the Gandhi residence. Their suffering called to him, weaving itself gently into the fabric of his emerging vocation. As he continued this unexpected journey, Vincent sensed that the purpose of his life was shifting like a river changing its course. He no longer desired the comfortable benefice he once pursued with such determination. Instead, he felt drawn towards something that frightened and attracted him in equal measure, to the service of those who had been forgotten, those whose lives bore the weight of human indifference. Perhaps he did not yet know how fully this calling would shape his future. But the quiet flame that had ignited in North Africa was now beginning to burn more steadily, illuminating a path he had never imagined. When his chains finally fell away, a changed man emerged into the world, though the fullness of his mission was only beginning to unfold. But where does a transformed heart go to begin again? From that question, where a transformed heart goes to begin again, the story now moves into the quiet, hidden years that tested Vincent more deeply than captivity itself. Freedom had returned him physically to France, and the early stirrings of compassion had begun to shape his interior life. Yet Vincent still walked with uncertainty, unsure of how to translate this new awareness into a concrete mission. The world around him did not immediately recognize the seeds of greatness quietly settling within his soul. Instead, he entered a season marked by obscurity, misunderstanding, spiritual confusion, and the slow discipline of grace. These years formed a bridge between the dramatic upheaval of his past and the luminous charity of his future. They were not marked by extraordinary events, but by the steady shaping of a man who was learning to surrender every corner of his heart to God. As Vincent served the Gandhi family, he continued to teach, preach, and care for the household, yet his deepest lessons often unfolded interiorly. His spiritual director, Pierre de Bérulle, urged him to cultivate humility and obedience as foundations for whatever God intended. Bérulle was a man of profound prayer, and he recognized in Vincent not merely talent or intelligence, but a pliability of heart that suffering had softened. Under his guidance, Vincent began to confront the subtle remnants of pride and ambition within himself. He discovered that transformation does not end with escape from suffering. It continues quietly as God purifies motives, softens desires, and reorders priorities. And so, even while living among nobility, Vincent sought opportunities to serve quietly, preferring tasks that offered no recognition. This humility did not come naturally. It required effort, reflection, and a steady openness to the movements of grace. Yet Vincent's spiritual journey was not without shadows. Shortly after beginning his service with the Gondis, he fell into a deep interior trial, a spiritual darkness that shook his confidence. Accusations of theft had earlier wounded him, but the more painful trial came from within. A fear that he had once, years earlier, confessed a sin improperly. This thought lodged itself in his conscience with disturbing force. In the spiritual climate of 17th-century France, such scruples could take hold easily, especially for those whose hearts were sensitive and striving for holiness. Vincent wrestled with the possibility that he had offended God, that his priesthood might be invalid, or that he was unworthy to serve. These thoughts tormented him, weighing down his prayer, unsettling his sleep, and straining his peace. It is a tender reminder that even saints experience spiritual turbulence, and that interior suffering can carve deeper spaces for God's presence. This period of doubt lasted several years. Vincent sought counsel from experienced guides, prayed earnestly, and continued his duties with outward calm, though inner storms persisted. It was during this time that he encountered François de Sales, the gentle bishop whose wisdom offered Vincent profound peace. De Sales, known for his serene spirituality, recognized the torment of a soul caught in scruples and reassured him that God's mercy was far greater than his fears. Their conversation, simple yet filled with grace, lifted a weight that had long pressed upon Vincent. The darkness did not vanish instantly, but a path toward interior freedom began to open. From this experience, Vincent learned to approach others with compassion, understanding how deeply the soul can suffer even in silence. These lessons would later make him a tender confessor and spiritual father to many. During these years, Vincent also encountered challenges in his relationships and assignments. Though the Gondi family valued him, not all interactions were harmonious. Differences in temperament, misunderstandings with fellow clergy, and the complex dynamics of noble households tested his patience. But these difficulties, rather than discouraging him, became training in charity. He learned to listen more than speak, to seek unity rather than triumph, and to respond with calm when confronted with frustration or criticism. Slowly, he developed the gentle strength that would one day define him. Spiritual maturity, he discovered, is not forged in moments of praise or success, but in the daily willingness to embrace humility and patience. It was also during this season that Vincent first recognized the profound spiritual hunger of the poor. Though he had begun to sense this earlier, the insight deepened now. He noticed that the peasants who worked the land were often deprived not only of material necessities, but also of spiritual care. Many had not seen a priest in years. Their confessions had been neglected. Their understanding of the faith was limited, shaped by hardship rather than teaching. Vincent felt a growing ache as he realized how neglected these souls were. And yet, he also felt the tension of his responsibilities to the Gondi family and to the direction of Betrayal. He could not simply walk away from his obligations, but neither could he ignore the stirring within him. This tension became a quiet prayer. Lord, show me what you desire. Amid this inner conflict, Vincent faced another trial, an unexpected period of unemployment and uncertainty. For reasons not entirely clear in historical records, he left the Gondi household for a time and entered a simpler life in Paris, supporting himself through modest teaching and pastoral work. These months, though undramatic, further emptied him of dependence on prestige. He lived more simply, prayed more deeply, and continued seeking God's will with quiet openness. It is often in these unremarkable seasons that God prepares souls for greater service. Vincent, living quietly among the poor in Paris, began to notice not only their material needs, but the profound dignity within them. Perhaps without fully realizing it, he was learning to see Christ where the world saw only misery. As these years unfolded, God was slowly drawing Vincent toward a mission that would soon reveal itself more clearly. A mission to revive the faith of the poor, to form better clergy, and to gather hearts around the transformative power of charity. But before that clarity arrived, he endured these years of testing, years marked by humility, uncertainty, obedience, and gradual surrender. Each experience, whether painful or quietly illuminating, formed one more facet of the man who would later reshape the Church's understanding of charity. Looking back, one might say that Vincent's true transformation did not occur at a single dramatic moment, but through a succession of gentle purifications, misunderstanding, accusations, spiritual darkness, simple work, guidance from wise mentors, and the slow deepening of compassion. Grace was at work not in flashes, but in rhythms, like waves smoothing rough stone. These years, though hidden, were indispensable. They formed the foundation upon which all his future work would stand. Every saint has a season when God teaches them to wait, to listen, and to surrender, not through great achievements, but through the quiet fidelity of daily life. And Vincent, though not yet fully aware, was now being shaped into the servant God had long envisioned. And in the quiet waiting of those hidden years, when Vincent's heart was being shaped more by obscurity than by accomplishment, Providence began to reveal to him the faces he was always meant to see: the poor, the forgotten, the spiritually abandoned, those hidden corners of humanity that had called softly to him since his childhood, now stepped into clearer view. It happened not all at once, but gradually, as though God were lifting a veil one thread at a time. Vincent had endured captivity, accusations, spiritual darkness, and long stretches of uncertainty. Through each trial, his heart had been softened, emptied, and readied for a deeper mission. Now, as he resumed his work with the Gondi family and continued occasional travels across their vast estates, grace began to align him with the very people who had been waiting for a shepherd without ever knowing his name. The countryside estates of France in the early 17th century were places of striking contrast. Within the walls of noble houses, life unfolded with polished routines, candle-lit dinners, and learned conversation. But beyond those walls stretched villages where peasants lived in cramped huts, worked the land from dawn until exhaustion, and suffered silently from lack of education and pastoral care. Vincent had always felt a delicate ache for these people, for he knew their world from memory. Yet his earlier ambitions had blurred his vision. It took the humbling years of trial to clear the eyes of his soul. And now, as he traveled with Madame de Gondi to oversee the spiritual well-being of the peasants on her family's lands, Vincent began to notice something that pierced him with a sorrow deeper than any suffering he had known in captivity: the spiritual abandonment of the poor. It began with small observations. A peasant who confessed he had not received the sacrament in years, a family who knew little of the faith beyond a handful of prayers, a village where no priest had visited in over a decade. These confessions did not shock Vincent in a dramatic way. Rather, they entered his heart quietly, stirring a deep, contemplative pain. He began to understand that the poverty afflicting these people extended far beyond hunger or material want. They were starving for the sacraments, for guidance, for the presence of a shepherd who would remind them they were not forgotten by God. Their souls carried burdens they had never been taught to name. Vincent listened with compassion, hearing in their voices the echo of Christ's words. They are like sheep without a shepherd. One day, while traveling with Madame de Gondi, he encountered a scene that would become a turning point. A dying peasant approached them, burdened with guilt for sins he had harbored for years, without knowing how to confess them. Vincent listened patiently and offered absolution, but the experience left a heaviness in his heart that did not fade. Madame de Gondi, moved deeply, asked how many others might be living with such suffering, hidden from the eyes of the world. That question lingered between them, giving shape to something new. Vincent felt the stirrings of a call, not the call he once imagined, lined with comfort and recognition, but a call that beckoned him into the forgotten spaces of rural France. He began preaching more intentionally to the peasants, not with fiery rhetoric, but with gentle clarity. His sermons were simple, grounded in compassion, shaped by a desire to reach those whose hearts had long been neglected. The people listened. They recognized sincerity in his voice, the voice of a man who had lived among the poor and carried the memory of their struggles in his bones. Vincent spoke not as one looking down from a place of privilege, but as one who walked among them, who understood the weight of poverty from within. In his preaching, the poor found not only instruction, but comfort, hope, and the assurance that God had not forgotten them. The first fruit of this new direction emerged quietly, yet would shape the future of charity in France. At Madame de Gondi's urging, Vincent helped organize a mission in the village of Folleville in northern France. On January 25, 1617, he preached a sermon that has since been regarded as the moment when the mission of Vincent de Paul truly began. He spoke to the villagers about confession, repentance, and God's mercy. The response was extraordinary. People flocked to confession, seeking reconciliation, guidance, and healing. Vincent was deeply moved, not by numbers or admiration, but by the realization of how desperately the poor needed spiritual care. He had discovered a vocation that resonated with every fiber of his transformed heart. But this moment did not lead him instantly into a life of public ministry. Instead, it became the seed of something still forming. Vincent realized he needed time to reflect, pray, and discern the full meaning of this awakening. And so, shortly after the Folleville mission, he made a surprising decision. He left the Gondi household and traveled to a remote village called Châtillon-les-Dombes, where he served as a simple parish priest. This choice, seemingly small, revealed the depth of his transformation. He did not fear obscurity. He did not seek advancement. He desired only to follow the gentle tug of grace wherever it might lead him. Life in Châtillon brought Vincent closer than ever to the world of the poor. He discovered a community suffering from illness, loneliness, and spiritual neglect. One Sunday, before Mass, he learned of a family where the mother lay gravely ill, and the rest were too weak to care for her. Vincent preached a homily urging the parishioners to show compassion, and that same afternoon, he discovered that dozens of villagers had visited the family, bringing food, comfort, and prayer. Their response revealed something profound to Vincent. Charity flows most powerfully when hearts are organized, guided, and united. This insight would become a cornerstone of his future mission. Vincent began forming small groups of laypeople, mostly women, to serve the poor with structure and continuity. These groups, the earliest form of the confraternities of charity, were born not from grand strategy, but from simple compassion awakened by a single family in need. Yet they would blossom into a movement that reshaped the Church's relationship with the poor. As Vincent continued his ministry in Châtillon, his heart settled into a new rhythm. He prayed with simplicity, served with tenderness, and listened with patience to the needs around him. The voices of the poor became the guiding melody of his days. He no longer felt pulled toward the ambitions that once defined him. Instead, he sensed a quiet joy in serving those whom society overlooked. The seed that had lain dormant during his captivity now began to bloom. In these moments of service, he began to recognize Christ not in grand ceremonies or noble houses, but in the weary eyes of villagers wrestling with hunger, fear, and sin. Their faces revealed the presence of God more clearly than any theological debate ever had. Vincent's entire vocation began to crystallize, to bring the love of Christ to the poor, and to bring the poor to the heart of Christ. When the world looked upon the countryside, it saw poverty. But Vincent, with his newly opened eyes, saw Christ hidden in suffering, inviting him deeper into a life of compassionate service. Could serving the forgotten become the key to his entire vocation? That question, whether serving the forgotten might hold the key to his entire vocation, accompanied Vincent like a soft, persistent echo as his life in Châtillon unfolded. The simple parish he had chosen as a place of quiet service was becoming a turning point, a place where grace gently gathered the threads of his experience, his childhood poverty, his ambitions, his captivity, his spiritual struggles, and wove them into a new vision of charity. The poor were no longer merely individuals in need. They had become the focal point of his prayer, the mirror through which he understood Christ more clearly, and the path along which God seemed to be guiding him. Yet even as his days filled with visits to the sick, comforting the dying, teaching the ignorant, and tending to parish needs, a deeper insight began to dawn within him. Charity could not remain a series of isolated gestures. It needed structure, order, and community. It required many hearts beating as one. The experience of the sick family in Châtillon, whose suffering galvanized the entire village into action, became for Vincent a quiet revelation. When charity was coordinated, when compassion was shared, the poor received not only relief, but dignity. The generosity of the people had been abundant, yet he noticed something that troubled him gently. After the initial outpouring of help, the enthusiasm waned. Visits stopped, resources dwindled. The family, still fragile, slipped once more into isolation. It was not that people were unkind. Rather, their goodness lacked continuity. Vincent understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that Christian charity must be steady, not carried only by momentary emotion. And so, in the same calm and deliberate manner with which he approached all things, Vincent gathered a small group of women in Châtillon and invited them to consider a new way of serving, one that was organized, sustained, and united in purpose. These women, moved by his sincerity and gentleness, listened as he spoke of meetings, shared responsibilities, and a plan to ensure that no poor family would ever again be abandoned after the first surge of compassion. They agreed to form a confraternity, a lay association dedicated to regular, discreet, and respectful service of the sick poor. It was a simple beginning. No grand design, no sweeping declaration, just a group of ordinary women responding to an extraordinary need. Yet in this beginning lay the seeds of a profound transformation in the Church's approach to charity. Vincent guided them carefully, always mindful that true charity must preserve the dignity of those it seeks to help. He emphasized that their service should be gentle, respectful, and free from any hint of superiority. The poor were to be treated as brothers and sisters, as members of one family in Christ. His instructions were practical, yet deeply spiritual. Meals should be delivered with kindness, visits made with humility, prayers offered with sincerity, and decisions taken with discernment. Over time, the Confraternity of Charity in Châtillon became a model of organized compassion, a light for other communities, and a testament to the power of people joined in service. Word of the confraternity's success reached Madame de Gondi, who sensed in Vincent something larger than parish work. She invited him to return to her household and expand this mission across the estates she and her family oversaw. Vincent accepted, not out of desire for influence, but because he now recognized that God was calling him to something more expansive, the renewal of charity across the countryside of France. When he returned to the Gondis, his heart no longer carried traces of the ambition that had once drawn him to noble circles. Instead, he saw their wealth and influence as instruments of grace, resources through which organized charity could flourish on a much larger scale. As Vincent introduced the confraternity model to other villages, something remarkable began to unfold. Ordinary women, peasants, widows, mothers, stepped forward with courage and tenderness, forming the backbone of a new kind of Christian service. They visited the sick, tended the dying, fed the hungry, and comforted the lonely. They worked quietly, without praise, seeking only to be instruments of God's love. Vincent, watching their dedication, felt humbled by their devotion. He had once dreamed of prestige, but now he saw holiness shining most clearly in these hidden lives. Their work, simple and often unnoticed, revealed the heart of Christ more powerfully than the rituals of court or academic halls ever could. Yet as the confraternities multiplied, Vincent recognized a challenge. These women needed guidance, spiritual formation, and support. Charity, like faith, requires nourishment. He began to write letters, offer instructions, and establish rules, not to impose rigidity, but to ensure that compassion flowed consistently and wisely. He taught them to balance zeal with prudence, generosity with discretion, and service with prayer. His guidance was always gentle, always grounded in the conviction that charity must never overshadow the dignity of the poor. As the movement grew, Vincent's understanding of charity deepened. He realized that true service did not begin with the giver's emotions, but with the needs of the recipient. Charity required listening, observing, and discerning. It required seeing Christ in each person, even when that person was difficult, ungrateful, or burdened by their own struggles. Vincent began to articulate principles that would later become hallmarks of his mission. That charity must be effective, humble, and infused with the love of Christ. That the poor must be served not hastily, but tenderly. That service must be both spiritual and material, and that the heart of charity is not pity, but respect. These insights did not arise from theory, but from lived experience. Vincent continued to visit the poor himself, training others not only through words but through example. He carried food, administered sacraments, prayed with the dying, comforted widows, and encouraged mothers caring for large families. In every encounter, he saw the face of Christ reflected in human fragility. And as he served, his heart widened. He understood more clearly that charity was not a temporary project, but a lifelong calling, one that demanded patience, perseverance, and deep trust in God. Despite his growing responsibilities, Vincent remained a man of simplicity. He did not seek recognition. He did not place himself above the women he organized. Instead, he learned from them. Their quiet determination, their tenderness, their resilience. These women, whom society often overlooked, became co-workers in his mission, and later the foundation upon which the Daughters of Charity would be built. But for now, the work of the confraternities remained the heartbeat of Vincent's days, a gentle, steady rhythm of faith expressed in action. Gradually, the truth became unmistakable. Charity was not merely a part of Vincent's life. It was the path God had chosen for him. The suffering he had endured, the lessons he had learned, and the compassion he had cultivated all converged into this moment of clarity. He felt it in prayer, in the quiet hours after visiting the sick, and in the faces of the people who depended on him. The vocation he had once pursued half-heartedly now revealed itself fully. To be a servant of the poor, a father to the forgotten, and an instrument through whom God's love could pour into the world. Charity, Vincent discovered, grows when many hearts beat as one. From the growing rhythm of those early confraternities, where simple women carried food to the sick and whispered prayers beside straw mattresses, Providence now prepared to place beside Vincent a companion whose soul would resonate with his own in ways neither could yet imagine. The mission that had begun with small acts of organized charity was ready to deepen, to refine, and to take shape with a new steadiness. But such a mission required another heart to share the weight and beauty of it. Grace often works through unexpected encounters, and the meeting between Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac would become one of the most quietly transformative partnerships in the history of Christian charity. Louise was a woman marked by contradiction, noble by birth, yet often made to feel painfully out of place, gifted with intelligence, yet plagued by periods of profound interior darkness, yearning for God, yet uncertain of the form her vocation should take. She had endured early loss, unstable family ties, and a marriage that brought both affection and sorrow. Her beloved husband, Antoine Legras, had been kind to her, but his long illness and eventual death left her fragile, grieving, and unsure of her place in the world. Even before his death, Louise had long struggled with spiritual confusion. She wrestled with fears about her vocation, wondering whether she had failed God or had misunderstood His will. In her deepest moments of uncertainty, she felt lost in shadows that seemed to stretch far beyond her own strength. Yet beneath these shadows was a heart refined by suffering, a heart quietly being prepared for a mission she could not have foreseen. It was during one of her most troubled seasons that Louise encountered Vincent. Bérulle, the same spiritual guide who had shaped Vincent, recognized that Louise needed a steady, grounded, compassionate director, someone who could see her suffering not as weakness, but as material for grace. He recommended Vincent, a decision that would gently redirect the course of history. At their first meeting, Vincent approached her with humility, aware that she needed reassurance rather than admonition. He saw not a troubled widow, but a woman of remarkable spiritual depth, someone whose experiences had forged tenderness, empathy, and resilience. Louise, for her part, sensed in Vincent a simplicity and sincerity that calmed her restless spirit. Yet their collaboration did not flourish immediately. Vincent, cautious by temperament and shaped by humility, initially hesitated to take on the spiritual direction of a noblewoman. He feared he might not understand her world or provide the guidance she needed. But God, patient and steady, continued weaving invisible threads between their lives. Over time, as Vincent observed the growing network of confraternities, he realized that their expansion required someone with skills he humbly admitted he lacked. The confraternities needed organization, structure, and gentle firmness. They needed someone who could nurture the women involved, provide training, oversee resources, and ensure that charity remained orderly and compassionate. Vincent had the vision, but not the administrative clarity required for such a broad mission. And it was Louise, disciplined, intelligent, and deeply committed to God, who possessed the gifts he lacked. When they began working more closely, a profound spiritual friendship blossomed, built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and a common desire to serve Christ in the poor. Louise visited confraternities, listened to the concerns of women, observed their methods, and helped refine their work. She wrote clear instructions, offered encouragement, and brought coherence to the growing movement. Her voice was gentle but confident, and her presence reassured the women she guided. Meanwhile, Vincent continued preaching missions, organizing priests, and discerning new ways to relieve suffering. Their roles were distinct, yet deeply complementary. He ignited the fire, and she tended it with care so it would not burn out. As their collaboration matured, both of them recognized something stirring within the confraternities themselves. Many of the women desired to serve with deeper devotion, not merely as volunteers, but as consecrated laborers for Christ. Yet the religious life available at the time was incompatible with their mission. Traditional convents required enclosure, separating sisters from the world. But the poor, the sick, the abandoned, they were not behind convent walls. They were in homes, hospitals, streets, and fields. They needed a new form of religious life, one that stepped into the world rather than withdrawing from it. This realization led to the birth of the Daughters of Charity, though at first in a form so humble it would have been impossible to predict the global movement it would one day become. Louise gathered a few young women who felt called to serve the poor with simplicity and dedication. They lived modestly, prayed together, and offered their days in service. Vincent watched them with a mixture of admiration and paternal concern. He wanted to protect them, guide them, and ensure that their mission stayed rooted in humility. He often reminded them, "Your convent is the house of the sick, your cell is the sick room, your chapel is the parish church, your cloister is the streets of the city." These words captured a startling new idea: that holiness could flourish not in seclusion, but in the noise, suffering, and unpredictability of the world. Louise shaped the spiritual and practical formation of these young women with remarkable tenderness. She taught them to see Christ not only in the poor they served, but also in one another. She encouraged them to embrace cheerfulness, patience, and humility. She instructed them to preserve the dignity of those they cared for, to listen with compassion, and to serve with their whole hearts. Many of these early Daughters of Charity had come from poverty themselves, and in their service they found not only purpose, but transformation. Under Louise's guidance, they grew into women of deep inner strength, capable of carrying burdens far beyond their youth. As the Daughters of Charity expanded, Vincent looked upon them with wonder. He had once imagined his life would be spent in quiet parishes or teaching roles, but now God had brought forth from his suffering and surrender a movement unlike anything France had seen. The poor were being served with dignity and regularity, not by noble patrons only, but by humble women whose hearts burned with love. Vincent often expressed that Louise was the true mother of the daughters, while he served as their spiritual father. Together, they formed a partnership marked not by equality of role, but by harmony of purpose. Their collaboration was not without challenges. They faced opposition from those who questioned the idea of women serving publicly. They encountered resistance from clergy who misunderstood their mission, and they navigated the complexities of forming a new kind of religious life in a church accustomed to older forms. Yet Vincent and Louise persevered through patience, trust, and prayer. They learned from each other constantly, he from her clarity and organization, she from his gentleness and humility. This partnership stands as one of the quiet wonders of Vincent's life. It shows how God often brings together two souls, each incomplete alone, to accomplish a work neither could achieve without the other. Their shared mission brought comfort to thousands of suffering people and transformed the very meaning of Christian charity in France. How gently God weaves together the threads of his servants. From the quiet weaving together of those two souls, Vincent and Louise, each strengthening and refining the other, another calling began to rise before Vincent like a dawn he had not expected. Charity had become the rhythm of his days, the melody of his prayer, the work through which grace revealed itself. Yet even as he poured himself into missions, confraternities, and the growing community of the Daughters of Charity, he increasingly encountered a deeper problem at the heart of France's spiritual landscape: the condition of the clergy. For every village where the poor lacked food and care, there was another where they lacked something even more essential: the presence of a priest capable of guiding them, teaching them, and leading them with humility. Vincent saw villages served by priests who were poorly trained, indifferent, overwhelmed, or disillusioned. He saw men entering the priesthood without proper preparation, lacking both spiritual discipline and theological clarity. He had once walked this path himself, ordained young and driven by ambition rather than a mature understanding of the sacred office. Now, with the fruits of his inner transformation growing more abundant, he recognized with clarity that the renewal of charity would never be complete unless accompanied by the renewal of the priesthood. This realization did not come in a sudden flash of insight. It unfolded slowly, shaped by countless conversations with villagers, observations during missions, and the guidance of spiritual mentors. Vincent began to understand that clergy reform was not a matter of discipline alone, nor of knowledge alone. It was a matter of formation, of shaping hearts as much as minds. A priest needed to know theology, yes, but he also needed compassion, humility, and the capacity to serve those entrusted to him. Without this, the sacraments risked becoming mechanical, preaching became empty, and the poor remained spiritually abandoned. Vincent felt these truths settling into the depths of his conscience, with a weight that could not be ignored. Charity could not flourish unless the shepherds themselves were renewed. His first response was simple yet profound: retreats. Vincent believed that priests needed time away from their parishes, time to pray, reflect, and rediscover the meaning of their vocation. He began organizing retreats in which clergy could gather for days of silence, instruction, and spiritual renewal. These retreats, which later became known for their transformative effect, combined practical guidance with gentle spiritual encouragement. Vincent did not berate or criticize the priests who came to him. Instead, he welcomed them with humility, offering his own life as testimony to the possibility of change. He spoke of the priesthood not as a position of privilege, but as a path of service, sacrifice, and closeness to Christ. Many men left these retreats with hearts softened, inspired to live their vocation more faithfully. Yet retreats were only the beginning. Vincent soon realized that proper formation needed to begin long before ordination. France lacked consistent seminaries, and many young men were ordained with little spiritual or academic preparation. Vincent envisioned something different: houses of formation where future priests could live in community, study theology deeply, practice prayer, and cultivate the virtues necessary for ministry. With the support of benefactors and the trust of church authorities, Vincent began establishing seminaries that embodied this vision. These institutions did not resemble the rigid academies of the past, nor the unstructured apprenticeships common in many parishes. They were environments of discipline balanced with kindness, structure balanced with prayer, study balanced with service. Vincent believed that a priest should be formed not only in the intellect, but in the heart, and it was this conviction that shaped the distinctive spirit of his seminaries. The Congregation of the Mission, founded by Vincent and composed of priests dedicated to serving the poor and training clergy, became the backbone of these efforts. Known today as the Vincentians or Lazarists, they were united by a shared commitment to bring the gospel to rural communities and to form priests who would serve with humility. Their rule was simple, grounded in the virtues Vincent himself embodied: gentleness, humility, zeal for souls, and charity. These men traveled to villages to preach missions, instructed seminarians with patience, and lived lives of modesty that reflected the dignity of their calling. Vincent guided them with a father's warmth, correcting without harshness, encouraging without flattery, and always reminding them that their work was not for their own glory, but for the good of souls. As Vincent's influence grew, he found himself drawn into a broader network of church leaders who sought renewal across France. Cardinal Richelieu, though often remembered for political ambition, recognized the importance of Vincent's work and supported his mission. Bishops wrote to Vincent asking for advice, requesting priests, and seeking guidance for their dioceses. While some clergy resisted reform, fearing that stricter standards might expose their own shortcomings, many others welcomed the clarity and support Vincent offered. His reputation for holiness, humility, and wisdom grew, not because he sought recognition, but because his life spoke a truth that others instinctively trusted. Yet even as Vincent embraced this larger mission, he did so with careful discernment. He knew that reform could not be achieved through condemnation or force. It could only grow through patient, loving formation. He refused to become harsh or judgmental, even when confronted with clergy whose behavior caused scandal. Instead, he approached every priest as a soul beloved by God, capable of change, and worthy of patient guidance. His tenderness did not diminish the seriousness of his mission, it strengthened it. By reforming the priesthood through compassion rather than coercion, Vincent introduced a spirit of renewal that touched hearts rather than merely correcting behavior. These years were demanding. Vincent's days were filled with teaching, preaching, organizing, writing letters, resolving conflicts, and guiding priests and seminarians. He traveled frequently, navigated complex relationships within the church, and balanced the expansion of the confraternities and the Daughters of Charity with the growing responsibilities of the Congregation of the Mission. Yet through it all, he remained grounded in prayer. His strength came not from his intellect or his administrative skill, but from his deep reliance on God. He spent long hours in silence, seeking the Lord's guidance before making decisions. The Eucharist became his anchor, the source of clarity and peace in the midst of constant demands. In these quiet moments of prayer, Vincent discovered the heart of reform: conversion. He understood that true renewal begins not with rules or policies, but with a heart transformed by grace. And so, even as he trained priests, he never ceased allowing God to train him. His humility remained intact, his compassion deepened, and his love for the poor, always his primary calling, continued to guide his decisions. By guiding priests gently and forming them deeply, Vincent helped rebuild the spiritual foundations of countless communities. The seeds he planted in seminaries, missions, and retreats would bear fruit long after his death, shaping the church for generations. True reform, he learned, begins in the quiet conversion of hearts. From the quiet conversion of hearts that guided Vincent's reform of the clergy, the story now moves into a darker and more turbulent landscape, one in which suffering stretched across France like a shadow, and charity was tested far beyond the boundaries of comfort. As Vincent continued to form priests, establish seminaries, guide the Daughters of Charity, and strengthen the confraternities, the world around him plunged into periods of war, famine, and relentless strain. The 17th century in France was marked by conflicts both internal and external, political tensions tearing at the fabric of society, and waves of hunger and disease that left the poor more vulnerable than ever. Vincent, whose heart had long been shaped by the cries of the suffering, found himself standing at the crossroads of need so immense that it threatened to overwhelm the fragile structures he had built. Yet in these dark years, his charity expanded, stretched, and deepened, not by heroic gestures, but by steadfast perseverance in the face of suffering that seemed without end. The 30 Years' War, which ravaged much of Europe, brought devastation that reached even remote villages. Armies swept through the countryside, leaving behind burned homes, ruined harvests, and displaced families. Refugees flooded into towns seeking shelter, food, and hope. Women wandered with children clinging to their skirts. Elderly men collapsed from exhaustion, and young people, stripped of family and security, drifted without direction. Diseases followed famine, and famine followed war in an unrelenting cycle. In Paris, Vincent witnessed scenes that pierced him deeply. Children begging in the streets with hollow eyes, starving peasants arriving from the countryside half alive, and entire families huddled in abandoned alleys, shivering from cold and fear. The problem was not isolated. It was widespread, overwhelming, and urgent. For many, such suffering would have produced despair or numbness, but for Vincent, it ignited a profound sense of responsibility, one that stirred him not to dramatic outbursts but to steady, organized compassion. He understood that charity now required courage, resilience, and the ability to see Christ even when misery obscured his face. He began mobilizing resources on a scale far greater than anything he had attempted before. Through the confraternities, the Daughters of Charity, and the generosity of the wealthy who trusted him, he organized relief missions to war-torn regions, sending food, clothing, medicine, and tools for rebuilding. He dispatched members of the congregation of the mission to devastated villages, where they not only preached and offered sacraments, but tended the wounded, buried the dead, and provided basic care for those who had no one left to help them. Vincent's compassion did not discriminate. He aided peasants, soldiers, widows, orphans, and even enemy combatants. He believed that every suffering person, regardless of cause or circumstance, bore the imprint of Christ. His letters from this period reveal a man whose heart was moved constantly by the weight of the world's sorrow. He wrote with urgency, pleading for more assistance, coordinating efforts across distances, and expressing anguish over the conditions he witnessed. Yet his tone remained rooted in hope. He trusted that God would provide the strength needed for the work, and he encouraged others to do the same. "Let us love God," he wrote, "but let us love him with the strength of our arms and the sweat of our brow." One of the most remarkable aspects of Vincent's service during these years was his ability to inspire others to share in the burden. He did not carry the weight of suffering alone. Instead, he empowered communities, trained volunteers, and encouraged collaboration among people from all walks of life. He reminded them that charity was not a task assigned to a few, but a calling entrusted to all. Women from noble families joined efforts by sewing garments and providing funds. Merchants donated supplies. Priests and brothers traveled to dangerous regions, and the Daughters of Charity placed themselves at the very heart of suffering, tending to the sick and dying with fearless devotion. Vincent's ability to unite people in service became a light amid the darkness of war. Yet the demands of these years took a profound toll on Vincent himself. He aged quickly, burdened not only by the physical strain of constant work, but by the emotional weight of what he witnessed. His compassion, while a source of extraordinary strength, also exposed him to deep sorrow. He wept for the refugees who died in his arms, for the children whose futures had been shattered, and for the villages wiped out by conflict. In moments of prayer, he laid these sorrows before God, trusting that divine mercy extended far beyond what human hands could accomplish. There were times when resources ran thin, when famine returned, when violence flared anew. But Vincent persevered, sustained by the belief that charity, even in its smallest expression, carried eternal significance. He faced criticism as well. Some accused him of interfering in matters beyond his station. Others questioned his use of funds or doubted the practicality of his relief efforts. Still others resented his ability to draw support and influence. Yet Vincent responded with characteristic humility. He did not defend himself with anger. He simply continued serving. For him, the judgment of others mattered little compared to the suffering of those who awaited help. During these years of crisis, Vincent also discovered the delicate balance between compassion and exhaustion. He encouraged his communities not to become overwhelmed by the enormity of need, but to focus on what could be done each day. "We must not try to do everything at once," he would say. "We must begin with what is possible." This wisdom preserved the energy of his workers and ensured that charity remained sustainable even in the darkest times. He often reminded them that God asked for fidelity, not perfection. As war raged on, the needs expanded. Orphaned children required homes, prisoners needed ransoming, families needed shelter, the sick needed care. Vincent responded with creativity and determination. He established homes for foundlings, supported hospitals, organized food distributions, and coordinated networks of relief that extended across France. In each of these efforts, he saw not only suffering, but the presence of Christ calling him deeper into the heart of charity. Through it all, his heart remained steadfast, though often stretched to its limit. He felt the weight of compassion pressing on him like a cross, not crushing him, but shaping him. He learned that charity is not merely an act of giving, it is an act of bearing, of carrying another's pain with patience and tenderness. And as the suffering around him grew, his capacity for love grew with it, revealing a truth that would define his vocation. Charity, when rooted in God, expands far beyond what human strength alone can sustain. How far can charity go when the world is breaking? And as the world continued to break around him, the question of how far charity could reach did not simply stretch outward for Vincent. It also began to turn inward, revealing another, quieter battlefield where he was called to persevere, the interior landscape of his own soul. For while he spent himself tirelessly in service to a nation fractured by war and poverty, Vincent gradually entered a more hidden season of spiritual darkness, physical weariness, and interior trial. It was not a dramatic crisis, nor a sudden descent, but a slow dimming of light, subtle, persistent, and quietly testing the foundations of the faith he had spent decades cultivating. Such seasons visit even the holiest souls. For Vincent, this new trial did not come from captivity, nor from the accusations that once wounded him in his youth, nor from the tumult of war, but from within. The mysterious night in which God sometimes draws his friends so that their love may deepen, purified of every attachment except himself. By this time, Vincent was an older man, his body bearing the marks of long journeys, sleepless nights, and the ceaseless labor of charity. Years of responding to urgent needs had worn down his health. He walked more slowly, rested less easily, and felt pains that lingered long after his tasks were done. Yet he rarely spoke of his discomfort. He simply continued, moving through each day with gentle determination. But beneath this perseverance lay a growing sense of spiritual emptiness. Prayer, once a source of clarity and peace, sometimes felt dry, distant, or obscure. Consolations that had sustained him earlier in life now visited him less frequently. He entered a stage of faith that many saints know well, loving God not through felt presence, but through perseverance in darkness. Despite this interior dryness, Vincent continued to give himself fully to others. He visited the sick, wrote letters of instruction, mediated conflicts, encouraged his priests, guided the Daughters of Charity, organized relief missions, and counseled souls in distress. To outward appearances, nothing had changed. His voice remained gentle, his demeanor calm, his judgment steady. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when he rose to pray, he sometimes felt an emptiness that tested the very core of his trust. He did not doubt God's existence. His faith remained firm, but he felt, at times, the absence of the warmth he once knew. It is a mark of true holiness that Vincent did not allow this darkness to turn him inward toward self, nor to weaken his charity. Instead, the absence of spiritual sweetness purified his intentions even more. He served not because he felt close to God, but because he believed in God, trusted God, and loved God above all else. Throughout this period, Vincent often counseled others experiencing similar trials, offering advice that revealed his own experience. That dryness in prayer is not a sign of abandonment, but an invitation to deeper fidelity. That God sometimes hides to teach the soul to seek Him more purely. That love proven in darkness becomes more real than love sustained by consolation. He rediscovered the truth that grace is not always felt. It is often known only in hindsight. And so he prayed faithfully, sometimes without joy, trusting that God saw his perseverance even when he felt nothing in return. In addition to this interior darkness, Vincent faced growing challenges within the communities he had founded. The Daughters of Charity, now numerous and serving in countless places, encountered difficulties that required his constant guidance. The demands on them were enormous, and some struggled with exhaustion or discouragement. Vincent wrote tender letters to encourage them, reminding them that their vocation was a gift, that their service touched Christ himself, and that God strengthened those who served with humility. At times, he had to correct misunderstandings, mediate tensions, and gently bring souls back to the path of patience. These responsibilities weighed heavily on him, especially as his strength declined. The congregation of the mission, too, faced its own trials. Young men, eager to serve but still learning discipline, required patience. Conflicts arose within certain houses, external pressures threatened their work, and church politics intruded into their ministry. Vincent, now in his 70s, became not only a founder but a father, one who bore the burdens of his sons with tenderness and sorrow. He spent hours in meetings, wrote countless letters, and traveled when he was able, though his body protested each journey. Yet even in fatigue, he remained steady, relying not on his fading strength, but on the grace he had learned to trust in earlier years. One of the most painful challenges of this period came from outside, from political tensions that placed Vincent in difficult positions. Cardinal Mazarin, who succeeded Richelieu, often clashed with members of the clergy, and Vincent found himself caught between loyalty to the Church and loyalty to truth. He advocated boldly for the poor, even when it displeased those in power. He defended innocent victims of political turmoil, sought peace amid conflict, and refused to compromise his conscience. These acts required courage, especially in a time when dissent could lead to severe consequences. Yet Vincent's courage was quiet, rooted not in defiance but in charity. Despite these external pressures, the deepest trial remained interior. Vincent's prayer continued in dryness, and his heart often felt stretched thin by sorrow for the suffering of others. He began to understand more profoundly the cross of Christ, not as a symbol of dramatic heroism, but as a daily endurance, a hidden offering of love. In his old age, he found himself drawn more frequently to meditation on the Passion, finding in Christ's silence a companion for his own. He realized that in this darkness, God was not absent, but asking him to share more intimately in the mystery of redemptive love. And yet, even in this night of the soul, moments of grace still flickered. He found consolation in the faithfulness of his communities, in the courage of the daughters serving in plague-ridden areas, in the determination of young priests dedicating their lives to the poor, and in the countless small acts of charity he witnessed each day. These glimpses of light reminded him that God's work continued, even when he personally felt dry. They strengthened him to continue forward with humility. In this period of weakness, one truth became more real to him than ever before: that the work was not his, but God's. He often told those around him, "We must not be disturbed if we see our plans fail. God knows better than we do what is good for His service." These words were not mere advice. They reflected the fruit of a lifetime of surrender. Vincent understood that holiness was not measured by success or comfort, but by fidelity to God's will, even when that will felt hidden. Still, the quiet flame of faith refuses to die. And in Vincent, it continued to burn with a steady, gentle light, guiding him through the final years of service that were yet to unfold. Still, the quiet flame of faith refuses to die. And as that quiet flame continued to burn, steady even in the darkness that tested him from within, Vincent entered the final years of his earthly journey. Years marked not by dramatic feats, but by a gentleness that had ripened through decades of surrender. His body had grown frail, but his heart, paradoxically, had grown wider. His steps were slower, yet his compassion deeper. His voice, once strong in missions and preaching, softened into a tone that carried wisdom and tenderness in equal measure. These later years did not diminish the work he had begun. Rather, they revealed its full beauty, like the late afternoon light that gives richness to the landscape before evening falls. Vincent's entire life had prepared him for this season of quiet service, where his presence alone, calm, faithful, listening, became a source of strength for those around him. Though weakened by age, he continued to oversee the congregation of the mission, the Daughters of Charity, and the many works of charity that had blossomed under his care. He could no longer travel widely, but he remained a guiding presence, offering counsel, writing letters, receiving visitors, and carrying the concerns of countless souls in his heart. His room in the house of Saint Lazare became a kind of spiritual center, where priests, sisters, and benefactors came seeking advice not from a man of power, but from a man of profound humility. Vincent often sat quietly as others spoke, listening with a patience that had become one of his greatest gifts. He responded not with grand declarations, but with gentle clarity, pointing always toward God and the needs of the poor. He no longer felt the urgency of youth, the restless desire to act quickly or decisively. His wisdom had become slow, steady, and deeply compassionate, like a river that has traveled far and now moves with quiet strength. Among the Daughters of Charity, Vincent remained a spiritual father whose presence brought comfort even when his physical abilities diminished. They often gathered around him, eager to share news of their missions and ministries. Some served in hospitals, caring for the ill and abandoned. Others traveled to war-torn regions, offering comfort where fear and hunger prevailed. Still others tended to orphans, the elderly, and the mentally ill. Vincent listened with tenderness to their stories, marveling at the courage and dedication of these young women who had given their lives to the service of the forgotten. He encouraged them to remain joyful, to support one another, and to persevere in small acts of love. He reminded them often that their strength did not come from themselves, but from Christ, who worked through their simplicity. Even in his weakest days, the daughters found in him a source of inspiration, for he embodied the very virtues he taught: humility, gentleness, patience, and unwavering trust in God. The priests of the congregation of the mission also continued to draw strength from Vincent's guidance. Though he could no longer preach missions in distant villages, he followed their work attentively, praying for them, advising them, and sending them forth with fatherly affection. He wrote countless letters, each filled with practical wisdom, spiritual depth, and a gentle insistence on charity. His words encouraged them to remain close to the poor, to speak with kindness, to avoid harsh judgments, and to remember that every soul entrusted to their care was precious to God. He knew that his own example, marked by suffering, perseverance, and faithfulness, would speak to them long after his voice fell silent. And so he offered his final years as a witness to the truth that holiness does not depend on activity, but on fidelity to God's will in every season of life. Even as his responsibilities continued, Vincent found himself increasingly drawn into quiet prayer. The dryness that had marked his earlier interior trial began to give way to a more peaceful, contemplative state. He no longer sought consolations or clarity. He desired only God's presence. In the silence of early mornings, he sat alone, his hands folded, his breath gentle, his heart resting in a trust that had grown through decades of surrender. He prayed for the poor, whose suffering never left his mind. He prayed for his communities, that they might remain faithful and united. He prayed for France, torn by conflict and hardship. And he prayed for the Church, asking God to guide her through the challenges of the age. This prayer, though simple, carried the weight of a lifetime devoted to God and neighbor. It became the quiet anchor of his final years. These years were also marked by a softening in Vincent's relationships. He who had once struggled with impatience now practiced gentle forbearance. He who had once wrestled with ambition now embraced humility with gratitude. His early anxieties and self-doubts had long ago faded, replaced by a peace that grew from knowing he had given everything to God. Those who visited him often remarked on the serenity that radiated from him, a serenity that did not deny suffering but embraced it with trust. He spoke little of himself, preferring to speak of God's love, of the dignity of the poor, and of the need for compassion in all things. His presence became a quiet blessing, like a lamp that glowed softly in a dark room. As his strength diminished, Vincent began to hand over responsibilities to others. He encouraged new leaders among the congregation and the daughters to take up the work with courage and humility. He trusted that God, who had begun the mission, would sustain it long after he was gone. He requested that his communities remain focused on prayer, simplicity, and service. He knew that human structures could falter, but hearts rooted in charity would endure. He reminded his followers that God alone was their rock, that Christ alone was their model, and that the poor were their teachers in holiness. In his final months, Vincent's body weakened further. Pain accompanied his movements, and fatigue lingered constantly, yet he refused to withdraw into himself. He welcomed visitors with a gentle smile, listened attentively to their worries, and offered words of encouragement even when speaking cost him effort. He continued to bless the daughters as they departed for new missions, sometimes lifting his hand only with great difficulty. He received priests who sought guidance, offering them the wisdom of a lifetime, distilled into simple, profound sentences. His room, though small and sparsely furnished, became a sanctuary where hearts found consolation. As the days drew to a close, Vincent sensed that the end of his earthly journey was near. But rather than fear, he felt gratitude. Gratitude for the grace that had carried him from ambition to humility, from captivity to compassion, from obscurity to a life poured out in love. He reflected often on God's mysterious ways, marveling at how suffering had shaped his vocation, how trials had purified his heart, and how grace had guided every step. In his final days, he felt no need to speak at length. Words had given way to silence, and silence had given way to surrender. What remains when a lifetime of service nears its close? From that quiet question, what remains when a lifetime of service nears its close, the story moves into the final tender hours of Vincent's earthly journey. His life, which had stretched across seasons of hardship, conversion, charity, and profound interior transformation, now approached its final chapter with a serenity that came not from strength, but from surrender. In these last days, the man who had once been driven by ambition, who had walked the dusty paths of captivity, who had dried the tears of the poor, and who had guided priests and sisters with patient wisdom, found himself resting in the stillness of old age. His body could no longer sustain the fullness of the mission he had embraced with such devotion, yet his spirit, refined through decades of sacrifice, shone with a gentle radiance that quietly filled the room where he lay. His passing would not be marked by fanfare or spectacle. Instead, it would unfold like a final blessing, soft, humble, deeply human, and deeply holy. The house of Saint Lazare, where Vincent spent his final years, had become a place of quiet reverence. Its hallways echoed with the soft footsteps of priests and brothers who had learned from his example, and its modest rooms carried the scent of prayer, ink, and weary compassion. Vincent's chamber, simple and spare, held only the essentials: a narrow bed, a crucifix on the wall, a small table where letters had once been written, and a chair where he had welcomed countless visitors seeking guidance. It was here, in the simplicity he treasured, that his final days unfolded. His physical strength had declined sharply. Pain marked his movements. Breath came with effort, and long hours of rest were needed to recover from even the smallest exertion. But Vincent did not complain. His acceptance of this frailty was itself a final act of humility, a silent offering of the body that had been poured out for others. Each day, members of his communities came quietly to his bedside. The daughters of charity, whose lives had been shaped by his gentleness and wisdom, entered the room softly, their eyes shining with affection and sorrow. They brought warm broth, adjusted the blankets, and sat nearby in silence, sometimes holding his hand or simply watching over him. For these women, many of whom had served in hospitals, tended dying soldiers, and witnessed the darkest sufferings of war, seeing their spiritual father weakened in body stirred a tenderness deeper than words. They felt as though they were returning to him the care he had given them for so many years. Vincent, for his part, accepted their presence with gratitude. Even when he could no longer speak at length, he expressed affection with a faint smile, a nod, or a whispered blessing. Priests of the congregation also gathered near him, seeking counsel in these final moments of his life. They did not come to burden him with decisions, but to receive his blessing and to anchor themselves in the peace he carried. Vincent spoke with difficulty, yet his words, though few, carried profound weight. He encouraged them to remain faithful to the poor, to avoid harshness, to cultivate humility, and to persevere in prayer. He reminded them of the heart of their mission: not brilliance, not eloquence, not acclaim, but love. Love for God and for those who suffered. His advice, distilled from a lifetime of experience, became a final testament to the men who would carry his work forward. Though weakened, Vincent did not retreat from prayer. He asked to receive the sacraments frequently, finding in the Eucharist a consolation that transcended the frailty of his body. When he could no longer kneel, he prayed, lying down, his eyes fixed on the crucifix that had accompanied him through his transformation. The Passion of Christ, so often his meditation and his anchor, now became his companion in an even deeper way. He saw his suffering not as punishment, but as participation in the love that had redeemed the world. Each moment of weakness became a quiet surrender into the hands of God, whom he trusted without reserve. Outside the walls of Saint-Lazare, the world continued with its turmoil, war, famine, political tension. But within the room where Vincent lay dying, time seemed to slow. Those who visited reported a stillness that felt almost sacred, as though God himself hovered near, receiving the final offering of his faithful servant. The noise of the city seemed distant. The sorrow of the poor, though present in Vincent's heart, no longer weighed on him with the same urgency. He had done what he could. He had given everything. Now, he rested in the certainty that God would continue the work through the communities he had shaped. As the final evening approached, the air in his room grew soft, as though touched by a quiet grace. Vincent's breathing slowed, and the lines of pain across his face softened. The brothers gathered around him prayed gently, their voices rising like a tender lullaby of faith. The Daughters of Charity stood nearby in silence, their hearts united in love and gratitude. Vincent's eyes, faintly open, seemed to rest not on the room around him, but on something beyond it, something unseen but deeply known. What he saw in those last moments remains a mystery, but those who were present sensed that he had already begun to behold the one he had spent his life, serving in the poor. With a final breath, peaceful and unhurried, Vincent surrendered his spirit on September 27th, 1660. His passing was not dramatic. It was quiet, like a candle's flame gently extinguished by a loving hand. The room, once filled with sorrow, settled into a stillness that felt almost like dawn. Those present felt a profound sense of peace, as though heaven had drawn near to receive him. Word of his death spread slowly at first, carried by whispers and soft conversations. Many wept, not because they believed he was lost, but because a father had gone home. His communities continued their work with renewed resolve, knowing that the best way to honor him was not through grand monuments, but through simple acts of love, the very acts he had lived day after day. Death becomes a doorway, not an ending. And for Vincent de Paul, that doorway opened onto the fullness of the love he had spent a lifetime reflecting into the world. Death becomes a doorway, not an ending. From that quiet doorway through which Vincent passed, softly, gently, as though following a familiar call, the story now widens to embrace not only the final breath of the saint, but the vast and enduring legacy he left behind. Death had carried him beyond the limits of human frailty, yet the work of his life, rooted in humility and shaped by grace, continued to unfold in ways he could never have imagined. The world he departed in 1660 was bruised by war and hardship, but into that wounded landscape he had planted seeds of compassion that would sprout long after his earthly journey was complete. The poor he had served, the priests he had formed, the sisters he had helped guide, and the countless souls who had touched his hands or listened to his voice, each carried a piece of his spirit. And from these pieces, a legacy emerged that would shape not only the church of his time, but generations and continents far beyond it. In the days following his death, Saint-Lazare was filled with a gentle sorrow. Members of the congregation of the mission walked with quiet reverence, remembering the simple words that had shaped their lives. The Daughters of Charity moved with a tenderness even deeper than before, feeling the absence of the man who had been their father, their teacher, and their guide. They wept not with despair, but with gratitude, for they had known him during his lifetime and carried his teachings within their hearts. And yet, even in their grief, they continued their service. Vincent would have wanted no interruption in the care of the sick, the feeding of the hungry, the teaching of children, or the comfort of the dying. His death became not a pause, but a gentle encouragement to step forward, not in his shadow, but in his spirit. As the years passed, the works he founded grew with remarkable vitality. The congregation of the mission continued to send priests to remote villages, preaching missions with the same simplicity and zeal that Vincent had instilled in them. They brought the sacraments to forgotten communities, taught catechism to those who had long been without instruction, and rebuilt the spiritual life of parishes broken by war. Their influence spread across France, then beyond its borders. In time, they traveled to Italy, Poland, Ireland, and eventually far into other continents. Each mission, each sermon, each act of charity carried the imprint of Vincent's belief that the poor deserved not only compassion, but respect. The Daughters of Charity, meanwhile, blossomed into one of the most extraordinary forces of charity the world had ever seen. Under the continued guidance of Louise de Marillac until her own passing, and then under the leadership of those she trained, the daughters brought gentle, organized care to hospitals, orphanages, prisons, and war zones. Vincent had once told them that their cloister was the street and their chapel the parish. They took these words to heart with unwavering devotion. Their simplicity, practicality, and tenderness became a model for a new kind of religious life, one rooted not in enclosure, but in presence, not in separation, but in service. They crossed borders and oceans, tending to the sick during epidemics, comforting the wounded in battlefields, and teaching in places forgotten by the world. Their habit, a simple gray dress and white cornet, became a symbol of hope wherever they walked. Over time, the seeds Vincent had sown took root in countless branches of what is now called the Vincentian family. Lay associations emerged that reflected his spirit, inviting ordinary men and women to participate in works of charity. New religious congregations formed, inspired by his example and dedicated to serving Christ in the poor. Seminaries continued to embrace his vision of forming priests not only in doctrine but in humility and compassion. His teachings on charity, practical, respectful, deeply human, became a touchstone for generations seeking to understand how the gospel speaks to suffering. But Vincent's legacy was not limited to institutions. It lived most profoundly in the hearts of individuals who, touched by his example, began to see the poor not as burdens, but as mirrors of Christ. His insistence on respectful charity reshaped the way society approached the vulnerable. He taught that the poor were not passive recipients, but active teachers, revealing the face of God in their perseverance and dignity. Over time, this way of seeing transformed cultures, inspired reforms, and helped lay the groundwork for modern expressions of Catholic social teaching. Though centuries have passed since Vincent walked the streets of Paris, his spirit remains visible in places where compassion is needed most. His name continues to inspire schools, hospitals, shelters, and charitable organizations. Among them stands one of the most globally recognized, the Society of Saint Vincent de Paul, founded in the 19th century by Blessed Frederick Ozanam, who saw in Vincent a model for living the gospel in the modern world. Through this lay movement, tens of thousands of people continue the work Vincent began, visiting the poor in their homes, offering friendship, and providing aid with the same tenderness that characterized his ministry. Their quiet presence serves as a living testament to the power of one man's faith, transformed by grace. Beyond institutions and associations, Vincent's legacy speaks to the soul of the Church. He demonstrated that holiness is not found in extraordinary visions or dramatic gestures, but in the patient and humble service of those most in need. His life teaches that suffering can become the doorway through which grace enters, that ambition can be transformed into compassion, and that even the most unlikely beginnings can lead to profound sanctity. His story reveals that charity is not simply an act of giving, but a way of seeing Christ in the poor, seeing hope where others see despair, seeing possibility where others see limitation. For those who reflect on his life today, Vincent remains a gentle guide. He invites us to step softly into the lives of the suffering, to listen with compassion, to give with humility, and to recognize that every encounter with the poor is an encounter with Christ. His journey, from ambition to captivity, from confusion to surrender, from service to sanctity, reminds us that holiness is built slowly, through small acts of love woven into the fabric of ordinary days. And as we close this long pilgrimage through his life, his legacy rises before us not as a monument of stone, but as a living flame, a flame carried in the hearts of all who continue his mission, all who see Christ in the poor, and all who believe that even the smallest acts of love can reshape the world. Perhaps the greatest charity is allowing God to reshape our hearts, just as Vincent allowed him to reshape his.